Princess Vel-Eri was a warrior, one of the fiercest in her entire alien race, the Exira. Known for her strength, intelligence, and pride, she had always believed her people's future was in their own hands. But now, that future seemed uncertain, threatened by a mysterious genetic flaw that no one could understand. The Exira had always been a proud species, warriors who fought to defend their honor and their lands. However, their numbers had been steadily shrinking over the past few decades as more and more of their people fell ill, unable to reproduce or even survive. Their leaders, the High Council, had tried everything: medicines, research, even space travel to search for a cure. But nothing worked. Now the Council had come up with an idea that Vel-Eri found horrifying. To save her species, they would have to breed with the humans, a race they had never seen as equals. Their DNA, scientists had confirmed, was compatible with the Exiras, just enough to potentially save them from extinction. But the thought of mingling her blood with a human, a species seen by the Exira as primitive and weak, was unbearable. Princess Vel-Eri's heart raced as the Council explained the plan. She was expected to take part in this solution. The idea of carrying the human child, of giving her body to an outsider, made her stomach twist with disgust. How could she, someone who had fought in countless battles, someone who had led warriors to victory, be reduced to this? The thought alone filled her with dread. "I will not do it," Vel-Eri declared, standing tall before the Council. Her voice was firm, echoing through the chamber with the weight of 1,000 battles fought. "I will never allow a human to breed with me." The room fell silent. Her words hung in the air, sharp and full of defiance. Vel-Eri's refusal wasn't just a matter of personal pride. It was a declaration that she would not allow her people's survival to come at such a cost. She had fought to protect her people's honor, and she would not let that honor be stained. The High Council, however, was not moved by her words. "You have no choice, Princess," the eldest counselor said, his voice cold and calculating. "The survival of your species is more important than your pride. We've tried everything else. This is the only option left." Vel-Eri's fists clenched, her sharp claws digging into her palms. She could feel the weight of the Council's decision, but she refused to accept it. She couldn't just lie down and let them dictate her fate. There had to be another way. She turned on her heels and stormed out of the chamber, determined to find an escape, to search for another solution that didn't involve human contact. As she ran through the halls of her palace, her mind raced. She had spent her entire life training, fighting, and leading, but now she felt helpless. The future of her people depended on something she could not control, something she could not accept. With each passing moment, the weight of her duty grew heavier. She had always been the strong one, the one others looked up to, the one who could be counted on to protect the Exira. But this time, there was nothing she could do. She could not change the Council's decision. She could not change her people's desperate need for survival. In a fit of frustration and fear, Vel-Eri made a decision. She would leave her home. She would flee to a distant world, far away from the reach of her people's control. She would find another way to save the Exira, one that didn't involve humans. As the sun set over her home planet, Vel-Eri boarded her personal starship, leaving behind everything she had ever known. She set a course for the nearest human colony, far beyond the reach of the Exira's influence. If she could just find a way to convince the humans to help, without asking for something in return, maybe, just maybe, she could save her people. But as her ship soared into the stars, leaving her home planet behind, one thought gnawed at her. Could she really escape the fate her people had chosen for her? The universe was vast, but the shadows of her people's decision followed her, and no matter how far she traveled, she couldn't escape the fear of what was to come. Princess Vel-Eri had thought she could escape her fate, but the universe had other plans. Her ship soared through the endless expanse of space, heading toward a distant human colony. She hoped that by reaching this human outpost, She might find a way to convince the humans to aid her people without demanding such a humiliating price. But her journey didn't last as long as she expected. Out of nowhere, Valeri's ship was struck by a barrage of laser fire. Her control systems flickered, and the ship's warning alarms blared. In the blink of an eye, the once stable ship began spinning out of control, the damage to the engine severe. She gripped the controls, desperately trying to regain control, but it was no use. The ship lurched violently, and with a sudden crash, it landed on a nearby planet. Dazed, Valeri staggered from her seat, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth from a blow to her head. Her body throbbed in pain, but her warrior instincts kicked in, and she forced herself to her feet. She had to assess the damage. She couldn't afford to stay here, helpless and alone. But before she could even reach the control panel, the hatch of the ship opened with a loud hiss, and armed human soldiers poured inside. Their uniforms were sleek, practical, and their expressions were stern. Valeri's instincts flared. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were prepared, organized, and well-trained. One soldier, a man with dark hair and a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes locked onto hers, calculating her every movement. "Hold it right there," he commanded, his voice firm and commanding. "You're not going anywhere." Valeri glared at him, her hand instinctively going for the blade she always carried at her side. She had no intention of letting herself be captured, not without a fight. But the soldier raised his weapon, no blaster, just a taser, and aimed it at her with deadly accuracy. "You're not going to fight us, alien," he said, his tone calm, though the threat was clear. "Come with us, and we'll sort this out." Her eyes narrowed. Sort this out? Valeri knew exactly what they would do to her. They would imprison her, use her for their own gain, just like the High Council had wanted. She wasn't about to let that happen. She spun quickly, darting for the exit hatch, her movements swift and calculated. But just as she reached the door, the man lunged forward and caught her arm with surprising strength. She twisted, trying to break free, but his grip tightened, pulling her back with little effort. She snarled, her sharp teeth flashing in the dim light of the ship. "You're not going anywhere," he said again, more gently this time, but with no less authority. Valeri took a deep breath, realizing that resistance would be futile. She allowed herself to be led out of the ship and into a small, enclosed vehicle waiting outside. The air on this planet was thick and hot, a far cry from the cool climate of her home world. She could hear the sound of engines roaring and the smell of exhaust in the air. The humans had set up a camp of sorts, but it wasn't the kind of place Valeri had expected to find. As they drove, Valeri tried to assess her situation. She was still a warrior, and her mind was sharp, but these humans were different than she had imagined. They were organized, smart, and they didn't seem afraid of her. Her entire species had viewed humans as weak and primitive, but these soldiers were anything but. Eventually, they arrived at a small, fortified building, surrounded by tall metal walls. The soldiers led her inside and pushed her into a room. It was plain, with just a simple cot and a table. There were no windows, only a door that seemed to be locked tight. Valeri paced, but no matter how many times she tried to plan her next move, she kept coming back to one thought. How did she end up in this situation? The soldier who had captured her entered the room a few minutes later. He was alone now, and he didn't look at her with fear or disgust. Instead, there was a quiet curiosity in his eyes, as though he was trying to figure out who she really was. "Are you going to just stare at me all day?" Valeri asked, her voice sharp. The man didn't reply immediately. He walked over to the table, setting down a small datapad and some food. "I'm Captain Daniel Hayes," he said finally, looking at her. "I'm not here to harm you. We don't need to fight." Valeri raised an eyebrow. "You're a soldier. It's your job to harm." "Not unless it's necessary," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "I'm here to get some answers. Why did you come here? What were you running from?" The question caught Valeri off guard. She hadn't expected them to ask, or to even care. She wasn't sure if she could trust them, but there was something in Daniel's eyes that made her hesitate. "I wasn't running," she said slowly. "I was seeking a solution, to save my people." Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking again. "From what? What's so terrible that it made you crash your ship on our planet?" Valerie sighed, her shoulders heavy. She wasn't sure if she could trust this human, but there was something about him that made her feel, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. Captain Daniel Hayes sat across from Princess Valerie, watching her as she toyed with the food he had given her. He had noticed that despite her fierce exterior, there was a vulnerability hidden beneath it. A struggle, perhaps, that she was too proud to reveal. He had always been good at reading people, understanding the emotions they hid behind their words and actions. But Valerie was different. Her gaze was intense, her posture unwavering. And yet, something told him that there was much more to her story than she had let on. She had spent the last few minutes avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Daniel could sense the tension in the room, but he didn't press her. Instead, he patiently waited for her to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Valerie looked up. Her sharp features softened, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I came here to escape," she began slowly, her voice low. "My people, my species, are dying. We've been struggling for years, and our leaders have decided to breed with humans. They believe your DNA will save us." Daniel blinked, surprised by the words. He had heard rumors of alien species wanting to interbreed with humans in the past, but hearing it from someone like Valerie made it all the more real. He took a moment to process what she had said, realizing the weight of the situation. "You're telling me you want us to help your species survive?" he asked, his voice careful. Valerie nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "That's what they've decided. But I can't. I refuse to let my people's survival depend on something so degrading." Daniel's heart ached as he listened to her. He had never thought of alien species in such a personal way before, but the pain in Valerie's voice made him see her in a new light. She wasn't some cold, distant warrior. She was someone who cared deeply for her people, someone who was willing to sacrifice everything for their survival. The strength in her words made him feel both admiration and sympathy. "I understand why you would resist," Daniel said gently. "It's a big decision. But Valerie, there might be another way." Her eyes snapped up, locking onto his with renewed interest. "Another way?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. He nodded. "Maybe there's a way to help your species without you having to give up so much. I've been trained to think outside the box. Maybe there's something we can do together, without the arrangement your people want." Valerie studied him for a long time, as though trying to decipher whether he was genuine or simply trying to manipulate her. She had learned to trust no one, not after everything her people had gone through. But for some reason, Daniel's words made her pause. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He wasn't asking for anything in return. For the first time since her capture, she felt a small spark of hope. Could there really be another way? "I don't know if I can trust you," Valerie admitted, her voice still guarded. "But I want to believe you. I want to believe there's a chance to save my people without compromising everything we stand for." Daniel smiled softly. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I do think there's a way forward, together. I've been trained in science, medicine, and technology. I might be able to help you find a cure, or at least a solution, that doesn't involve what your leaders are asking." Valerie felt a knot loosen in her chest. She had spent so long running from the idea of being forced into a union with a human that she had never allowed herself to consider the possibility of an alternative. But now, for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope, a way to help her people without sacrificing her own beliefs. But before she could say anything more, the door to the room opened with a loud clang. A new soldier stepped inside, his face hard and unreadable. It was clear that he had not come to offer Vel-Eri any comfort or answers. "Captain Hayes," the soldier said, his tone sharp, "we need to move out. There's been word of a potential threat in the area. We're on high alert." Daniel stood, his gaze shifting briefly to Vel-Eri before he addressed the soldier. "Understood. I'll be there in a moment." He turned back to Vel-Eri, his expression softening. "I'm going to help you, Vel-Eri. I'll find a way to save your people. But first, we need to stick together. I'll need your trust if we're going to make it through this." Vel-Eri's mind raced. She had always prided herself on her independence, on never needing anyone else. But now, as she looked into Daniel's eyes, she couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, this human soldier could help her change the course of history. As Daniel left the room to prepare for the mission ahead, Vel-Eri remained seated, her thoughts swirling. She had been so sure of her path, so certain that she could face her people's problems alone. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Could this human soldier really help her? Could he offer a solution that would save both her people and her dignity? The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she was no longer alone. And that was the first step toward finding the answer. The day after Daniel left, Vel-Eri found herself staring out of the small window in the room. The human base outside was quiet, but she could feel the tension in the air. It was clear that something important was happening. The soldiers were moving with purpose, checking their gear, preparing for an unknown threat. But it wasn't the soldiers she was focused on. It was the chance that Daniel had given her. She had never thought she'd be here, on a human base, working with humans. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she was running out of options. If her people were to survive, they needed help, and Daniel had promised to find another way. It felt almost like a dream, and Vel-Eri couldn't help but wonder if it was too good to be true. Could a human really help her people, or would this be just another disappointment? The door to her room opened, breaking her train of thought. It was Daniel, looking as calm as ever. He was in full combat gear now, the familiar weapon at his side. Despite his serious expression, there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at her. "We're about to head out," he said. "You need to come with us." Vel-Eri stood up immediately. Her instincts told her to trust him. After all, she was on this planet because of him. But that didn't mean she was fully convinced. A part of her still wanted to resist, to run. After all, she was a princess, a leader of her people. She had been taught to never rely on anyone, to fight and solve problems alone. But something in Daniel's words, his presence, made her hesitate. He had offered a way forward, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep ignoring that hope. As they walked out of the room, Vel-Eri saw the human soldiers gathered near the edge of the base. Their weapons were ready, and there was a sense of quiet determination in the air. The team was preparing for something serious, and she couldn't help but feel nervous. This wasn't the kind of situation she was used to. Back on her home planet, she led warriors, and they fought together for survival. But here, with these humans, she was the one who felt out of place. "Is this the mission you were talking about?" Vel-Eri asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. Daniel nodded as he walked beside her. "Yes, we've gotten word of an enemy force approaching. We're going to intercept them before they reach the base." Vel-Eri raised an eyebrow. "You plan to fight them?" "That's the plan," Daniel replied, looking over his shoulder at her. "But I need you to stay with the group. You're not trained for this kind of combat." Vel-Eri felt a surge of anger at his words. She had fought in battles before, real battles, not some human skirmish. "I can fight," she said sharply. "I am not some helpless princess." Daniel stopped and turned to face her. His eyes softened, but his tone was firm. "I know you can fight, but you don't have to do it alone. We're in this together now." The words hit Vel-Eri harder than she expected. She had always believed that she needed to stand alone, that showing weakness was the worst thing a leader could do. But here, among these humans, there was no shame in relying on others. She didn't have to fight alone anymore. With a heavy sigh, Valerie nodded. "All right. I'll stay with the group." Daniel gave her a small smile, his eyes full of approval. "Good." As they continued walking toward the base's entrance, the sounds of the soldiers preparing grew louder. Valerie could feel the energy in the air, the adrenaline of a mission about to begin. The soldiers were ready for battle, and even though she wasn't part of their team, she couldn't help but admire their confidence. When they reached the vehicles, Daniel turned to her one last time before they boarded. "Stay close. We'll get through this, I promise." Valerie didn't respond immediately. She just gave a small nod, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. The convoy set off toward the outskirts of the base, the engines of the vehicles rumbling beneath them. As they drove, Valerie couldn't help but wonder about the humans' true strength. She had heard stories of their battles and their victories, but this was her first time witnessing their resolve up close. These humans weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for each other. And that made Valerie realize something important. Maybe it wasn't just about saving her people anymore. Maybe it was about saving something else, something more meaningful than just survival. As the convoy moved deeper into the unknown, Valerie glanced at Daniel once more. Despite everything, she found herself trusting him more than she ever thought possible. He had offered her a chance, and now it was up to her to make sure they both saw it through. The convoy had been driving for hours, and Valerie could feel the weight of anticipation in the air. The soldiers were focused, their eyes sharp and alert. Even the usually calm Daniel seemed to be on edge, his hand resting on the weapon at his side, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Something was coming, and Valerie could sense the urgency in their movements. They were deep in enemy territory now, far from the safety of the base. She had never experienced anything like this. Everything was so different from what she had known. Back home, they had prepared for battles, but this felt more like a mission. These humans fought with purpose, not just for survival, but for something bigger. Valerie couldn't help but be impressed by their determination. As the convoy sped through the dense forest, the trees began to thin, revealing a large clearing ahead. Daniel gave a signal to the driver, and the vehicle slowed down, coming to a halt. Valerie's heart raced as she looked out across the open space. The area was eerily quiet, too quiet. "This is it," Daniel said in a low voice. He turned to Valerie, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay close. We don't know what we're up against." Valerie nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon strapped to her side. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what lay ahead, but there was no turning back now. Her people's fate, and perhaps her own, was tied to this mission. The soldiers disembarked from the vehicles, moving with precision as they set up a perimeter around the clearing. Daniel stayed close to Valerie, keeping a watchful eye on her. He knew she was capable of handling herself, but he also understood the danger of rushing into an unknown situation. As the minutes passed, the silence grew thicker. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Valerie's mind raced. What was out there? Was the enemy already preparing to attack? Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching against the underbrush. The soldiers tensed, their weapons raised in an instant. Valerie's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the tension building, the moment of confrontation drawing closer. "Stay low," Daniel whispered to her, pulling her gently behind a large tree for cover. Valerie crouched down, her eyes scanning the area as the soldiers prepared for the worst. The noise grew louder, the footsteps now accompanied by guttural growls. The enemy was close, too close. Valerie's mind raced. She had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for her life. This was a fight for her people's future. Out of the trees emerged a group of heavily armored creatures. Large, hulking figures with jagged features and glowing red eyes. Valerie's stomach churned. These were the same species her people had been fighting for years, the ones responsible for the destruction of countless civilizations. Daniel's voice cut through the tension. Take them out quickly. Don't give them a chance to regroup. The soldiers moved into position, and Valeri felt her body respond automatically. The training her people had drilled into her kicked in. She was no longer a helpless princess. She was a warrior, ready to protect her people. The moment she'd been dreading had arrived. Fire, Daniel shouted, and the soldiers opened fire. The clearing erupted in chaos as blaster shots rang out, cutting through the air. Valeri wasted no time. She emerged from behind the tree, her weapon raised. The first enemy was already charging toward them, but she was ready. She took aim and fired, the blast hitting the creature square in the chest, sending it crashing to the ground. The others weren't far behind, and the battle intensified. Valeri moved with precision, her every action calculated. She ducked behind cover, reloaded, and fired again, each shot finding its mark. Her heart raced, but her focus remained sharp. This was what she had trained for. Daniel was nearby, directing the soldiers, his voice cutting through the noise. He was calm, even in the heat of battle, his every move showing the confidence of someone who had seen combat before. Valeri couldn't help but admire him. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a leader, and he trusted her to fight alongside him. The battle continued, but slowly, the enemy began to fall back. The creatures were no match for the soldiers' coordination and firepower. It wasn't long before the clearing was littered with their fallen bodies, the remaining enemy forces retreating into the woods. Breathing heavily, Valeri looked around at the battlefield. The soldiers were catching their breath, checking their weapons, but Daniel was already moving toward her. He looked exhausted, but there was a spark of satisfaction in his eyes. "You did good," he said, his voice gruff but warm. Valeri nodded, her heart still pounding. She had fought. She had won. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to save her people without losing herself in the process. As they regrouped and prepared to return to the base, Valeri glanced at Daniel. The trust between them had grown stronger during the fight, and she realized that what they were doing together was bigger than any battle they faced. It was about finding a new path for her people, a path that didn't rely on old traditions or sacrifices. For the first time since her arrival, Valeri allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future she could shape, and it was all thanks to Daniel. The journey back to the base was quieter than Valeri had expected. After the intense battle, the soldiers were more subdued, their minds still processing the fight. Valeri could feel the weight of what had just happened, the victory, the loss, and the realization that things were changing. She wasn't the same person she had been before she met Daniel, and her people wouldn't be the same either, not if they had any hope of survival. As the convoy neared the base, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the landscape. It was a peaceful sight, a contrast to the chaos they had just experienced. Valeri found herself looking at it differently now. The world didn't feel so harsh. There was beauty in it, something she hadn't truly seen until now. Daniel sat beside her in the front of the vehicle, glancing over at her every now and then. His expression was calm, but she could tell that he was still processing the battle too. It wasn't just the fight that weighed on him, though. Valeri could sense that Daniel was struggling with something deeper, something he hadn't shared with her yet. "You did well back there," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter than usual, and Valeri could tell he was trying to find the right words. Valeri gave him a small smile, her eyes still on the landscape ahead. "I only did what needed to be done." Daniel nodded, but there was something in his gaze that made Valeri look at him. He wasn't looking at the horizon. He was looking at her, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite place. "That's not what I meant," he said softly. "You fought like a true warrior. Not just for yourself, but for all of us. You made a choice today, Valeri, and it was a big one." Her heart skipped a beat. A choice. She hadn't thought about it that way. She had simply fought because it was what needed to be done. But looking back, she realized something. She had chosen to stand with Daniel and the humans. She had chosen to trust them, to fight alongside them. Maybe I've been afraid of trusting anyone for too long, Valerie admitted, her voice low. I've always been taught that I should rely on no one but myself. But now, I'm not sure anymore. Daniel was quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. Then, with a small sigh, he said, "It's not easy, is it? Trusting someone else, but you don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." Valerie's eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. He wasn't just trying to protect her. He was offering her something more, something deeper than just survival. It was a bond, a partnership. "I've never had anyone to rely on," Valerie said quietly. "Not like this. I've always been the one in charge, the one who makes the decisions." Daniel nodded slowly. "I get that. But sometimes it's okay to let others help you, to share the burden." Valerie wasn't sure what to say. The idea of leaning on someone else, of sharing her responsibilities with another, was foreign to her. But there was a part of her that felt the truth in his words. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of her people's survival alone. Maybe it was time to accept help. As the base came into view, the soldiers began to prepare to disembark. Valerie could see the familiar figures moving in the distance, waiting for their return. But as she looked back at Daniel, she realized that this wasn't just a mission anymore. This was something bigger than either of them. It was about finding a new way forward, for her people, for herself, for everyone. The convoy finally came to a halt, and the soldiers began to unload the equipment and prepare for debriefing. Valerie was about to step out of the vehicle when Daniel placed a hand on her arm. His touch was brief but firm. "I know you have a lot to think about," he said quietly, "but we can't stop now. We've made it this far. We need to keep moving forward." Valerie turned to face him, her eyes searching his. There was so much she wanted to ask him, but for now, she just nodded. "I understand," she said softly, "and thank you for everything." Daniel smiled, his expression genuine. "We're in this together, Valerie. Don't forget that." As she stepped out of the vehicle, Valerie felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. The battle was over, but the journey was far from finished. There was still so much to do, so many challenges ahead. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. And that made all the difference. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the base as Valerie stood outside the command center, her mind swirling with thoughts. The past few days had been a whirlwind of change, and she still couldn't fully process everything that had happened. The battle, the choices, the unexpected bond she had formed with Daniel. It all felt surreal. But there was no denying the shift that had taken place. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a leader, a fighter, and in many ways, a new person. The evening air was cool, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of earth and fresh grass. Valerie took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. There was so much to consider, so much to plan. Her people were counting on her, and the weight of that responsibility was heavier than ever. But now she had something she hadn't had before: hope. And perhaps more importantly, she had a team. Humans who had fought beside her and trusted her with their lives. Daniel appeared beside her, his presence calm and steady. He had become her anchor in the storm, and she realized that without him, she might have lost her way. He had shown her what it meant to fight not just for survival, but for something greater. It was a lesson she would carry with her always. Thinking about the future, Daniel asked, his voice low but filled with understanding. Valerie nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the distant sky. "There's so much to do. My people, they need me to lead them. But I can't do it alone." Daniel's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to. We're all in this together. You've already proven what you're capable of. You don't need to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. We've got your back." His words brought a sense of warmth to her chest. She had never been one to rely on others, but Daniel's unwavering support had changed her perspective. Maybe it was time to stop thinking of herself as the only one who could save her people. Maybe the real strength lay in unity, in standing together. "I didn't think it was possible," Valerie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "To trust others. To let go of the idea that I was the only one who could protect them." Daniel gave a small chuckle. "You've always had strength, Valerie, but strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to trust, when to let others help. That's something I think you're starting to understand." Valerie turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. The connection between them had grown stronger over the days, built on respect, shared experiences, and the challenges they had overcome together. She had never imagined that a human, someone from a completely different world, could become such an important part of her life. But here they were, and she knew deep down that their bond was something rare and precious. "I think you're right," Valerie said softly, "and I'm ready to stop doing everything alone. But there's one thing I still don't understand." "What's that?" Daniel asked, his expression curious. "Why do you keep helping me? Why do you believe in me, even when I don't believe in myself?" Daniel's smile was gentle, his eyes warm. "Because you're more than just a princess, Valerie. You're a warrior. You're someone who fights for what's right, even when it's hard. And that's something worth believing in." Valerie's heart swelled with emotion at his words. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a symbol, not as someone with a title to live up to, but as herself. And that was all she needed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Daniel's hand rested on her arm for a moment, offering comfort without saying another word. The moment stretched between them, peaceful and quiet, as the world around them seemed to slow down. There were still battles to fight, decisions to be made, and challenges ahead. But Valerie was no longer afraid. She had the strength of her people behind her, and with Daniel by her side, she felt like she could face whatever came next. "Are you ready to go back in?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence with a question that felt almost casual, yet full of meaning. Valerie nodded. "Yes. Let's do this. Together." As they turned toward the command center, Valerie felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. She wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Valerie felt confident that, no matter what challenges they faced, she was ready. She would lead her people to a better future, not as a princess alone, but as part of something bigger, something stronger. And in that moment, Valerie realized that her journey had only just begun.